Hello and welcome to India Speak, the Center for Policy Research's podcast series. I'm Yamini Aiyar, and I bring to you today the last installment of our four-part series, a conversation between me and Dr. KP Krishnan on India's civil services, its original design, the changes that have been brought about in the original design, both explicitly and implicitly, owing to the shifts in our social and political culture and the deepening of our democracy, and in the last two episodes, a discussion on the direction that civil service reforms ought to take. In last week's edition, we spoke about the relationship between India's economic transitions and the direction for civil service reforms, such that civil service reforms could create for an enabling environment for economic progress in India and respond to the economic needs of the 21st century. In today's episode, we will talk about India's democratic transitions and the relationship between India's democracy and civil services, and how the two need to go hand in hand in our debates and understanding of what it takes to reform civil services. India's democracy will only be strong if India's civil services respond effectively to our democratic needs, and vice versa. India's civil services will only be strong if it enables and strengthens Indian democracy. So we talk with Dr. Krishnan today about the relationship between democracy and civil services, between politicians and civil services, and look forward to how best to enable this relationship in a way that's perhaps somewhat different to the Humphrey-Hacker relationship that often comes to mind when we think of how politicians and civil servants interact with one another.
Let's shift gear a little bit to talk about democracy and what the emerging dynamics of democracy have done to the civil services. In our last conversation, you spoke a lot about the need in some ways of deeper democratic representation finding its way into the original design of the civil services. So reservation policies was an important element. Expansion of the state cadres and the state cadre promotions into the IAS was a second part of that. A related part that we touched upon, but I would like to hear more about from you and also in the framework of what next, is the issue of the relationship between the politician and the bureaucrat, which is often articulated as the critical challenge. There's too much embeddedness. At some level, the constant transfers of bureaucrats, which was very much part of the story of the 1990s and 2000s, was part of that. And you speak in your chapter as well about tenure, of course, but you also talk about this sort of the passive politicization that enters into the bureaucracy. Where you nod to the will of the master and you don't necessarily always advise appropriately. One of the arguments has been, therefore, that the separation between politics and between democracy and bureaucracy at some level, I'm exaggerating here, but to make the point, is necessary. And that even permanency of tenure is one example. There was a court case, if you recall, in the early 2000s, TSR versus the union, where they pushed for securing tenures at the district magistrate level as well. So is that a way forward to hold on, or how to think about this question of politicization?
On politics, I think one needs to first acknowledge that a lot of times, and we bring this about, we sort of mention this in our paper, the paper by T.V. Somanathan and I, the role of politicians is very often, quote unquote, said to be interference, whereas in reality, it's much more nuanced than that. And politicians play a very constructive role, and we very often don't get to hear of this because they are not, the ones who go around publicizing their role in these sort of nuanced interventions in the civil service. And I want to give an example. This is the Asian financial crisis, and lots happening in the international markets, and the exchange rates of all currencies are extremely volatile, and India is going through its own problems. The then governor, Dr. Bimal Jalan, wanted a particular sort of policy stance, and he was keen that this be accepted, because it's a decision which is technically that of the Reserve Bank of India, but it has enormous political implications. Exchange rate movements, by definition, are not just economic phenomenon, because there are huge gainers, huge losers. It has serious implications for policy and for politics. So he came. I remember Dr. Jalan describing it in graphic detail to me. I'll not be able to cover all of it, but the interesting point he made was, he suggested a particular course of action to the then Prime Minister, Mr. Vajpayee. Mr. Vajpayee heard him out and said, yeah, it's a good idea, but you're going to meet with very stiff resistance. He said, why, sir? He said, my Deputy Prime Minister and Madam Sushma Swaraj and perhaps Dr. Murali Manohar Joshi will not agree with you. They believe that the rupee should be at a certain level. And this doesn't come necessarily from a deep understanding of economics. This is their sense of politically what is acceptable. So I think you should go and persuade them. Dr. Jalan said, I don't think that's a good idea, sir. Rather than talk individually to them, since they are all members of the Cabinet Committee on Political Affairs, why don't you call them? I'll have a meeting. Yes, they had a meeting, and Dr. Jalan was asked to do a presentation. He did a presentation, and as agreed with the then PM, he proposed the exact opposite of what he had wanted. And Dr. Jalan tells me that meeting hall exploded. Mr. Vajpayee looks at Mr. Jalan, stops him midway and says, Dr. Jalan, are you telling us that our currency is weaker than that of Pakistan? He says there was 1 minute silence, and then the whole cabinet room broke into agitation. And who led the agitation? Deputy Prime Minister Advani Sahab, Madam Sushma Swaraj, and Dr. Murali Manohar Joshi, vigorously arguing, this is unacceptable. You have to do all that you need to do to set this right. And Mr. Vajpayee literally pulled up Dr. Jalan, saying that how can you even suggest this with our government? Sorry, the presentation ends now. Please do what we are telling you, namely, go and strengthen the rupee. Meeting ended. They all sort of got up to leave, and Dr. Jalan was leaving. Vajpayee Sahab looked at him and said, please stay for a minute. Fine. The others left. As soon as they left, he apparently made him sit down and winked at him and said, Dr. Sahab, आप अर्थशास्त्री हैं, आप अर्थशास्त्र कीजिए, राजकीय हम पे छोड़ दीजिए. And this is one example. I have personal examples of at least 10 such examples of ministers you would least expect. A state minister who wasn't exactly known for his democratic decentralization credentials, and I was his secretary, and we fell out, and I was moved out of that department. I moved away. A good month later, this minister shows up in my house to sit and understand from me the arguments for why urban local body of Hubli should be given the power to fix tariff. So, but I said, what is the sort of pressure? He said, no, there is a decision by the party that we are going to have a convention of all the elected municipal people. And I want to make some serious announcements. So please tell me the economics and law of democratic decentralization. And they actually went and did a lot of what we said. Now, I'm giving you two contrasted examples primarily to make the point that, contrary to our belief, serious reforms happen when politics agrees with technical civil service advice. So, broad point one, let's not downplay the role of politics and the role of politicians in governance. And here I am somewhat closer to the kind of position that Shekhar Gupta very often articulates in his column, that we tend to only play up the negative side of politicians in the form of transfer, in the form of interference in an individual order. I'm not saying that doesn't happen, but I think we need to realize that there is a genuine, serious role for politics. And as Mr. Karunanidhi famously asked his finance secretary, Mr. Venkateshan, Mr. Venkateshan, do you write the IAS every 5 years? He said, no, sir. I wrote the IAS in 1952 or whenever. He said, I write the IAS every 5 years. I need to go back to the people, and that is my IAS. So I think we need to realize that we are coming from very different sort of dynamics. So having said that, what is the appropriate relationship between politicians and civil servants and between democracy and bureaucracy, as you put it? I think if we understand this larger role, and both need to understand this larger role, typically the transactional role of the politician is minimal and the policy role of the politician is higher. It is minimal, it is not absent. Whereas it's the other way for the civil servants. Very often, and we've documented this, the politician may be interested in the transactions, but unfortunately, the civil servants are also focused on a lot of the transactions for not entirely the right set of reasons. So the blame, quote unquote, will lie somewhere, on all sides. In the state governments, typically, there is much less tolerance of the civil service transactional independence. Typically, in the union government, politicians, by and large, in the nature of things, there aren't too many transactional things in the government of India. Government of India politicians tend to be much more cerebral, much more engaged on policy, and they genuinely resolve conflicts of a kind which only politics can resolve. Civil service can give advice. Whereas in the state, very often, there isn't too much policy making, there isn't too much legislative action. Largely, it is transactional. And in that schema, the politicians tend to get into transactions, and then all of that interference stuff happens. What is the way forward? The way forward is what the Constitution says. There is no escape from that. The via media of my sort of trying to carry out the requests of politicians, whether legitimate or illegitimate, so as to be able to persuade him or her in a larger goal, doesn't very often work, because it then draws the civil service more and more into transactional things. So here I am somewhat of a purist. I don't think one can be quote unquote half pregnant or a little pregnant. There is a basic design where if I am district magistrate, if I have discretion vested in me, I have to exercise that discretion entirely as per administrative law and domain considerations. I cannot import requests of X, Y, and Z into this. The moment I begin to do that, I slip, and then you keep slipping. So the answer is we have to re-establish in a lot of these areas rule of law. Can you then protect the civil servant by those activist type moves, prescribing tenure, etc.? I don't think we can keep legislating for good governance. There is a point up to which you can legislate. But I think I'm reminded of what we in economics and law and economics call the theory of incomplete contracts. There will be a lot of things that cannot be put down in legislation. These are good governance conventions which have to evolve. Isn't 75 years long enough to evolve? Perhaps not. In the history of a nation, 75 years is still a small period. But yeah, there is a problem. I'm not understating the problem. The solution may not be easy. The solution may be persisting with rule of law and the Constitution of India.
I'm going to ask you a controversial question, which is that often when we talk about bureaucratic reform, we always say that the inability to fire is part of the problem. The protections that the Constitution offers, which in one of our earlier podcasts, you made the case for those protections, arguing that that is precisely what was put in place to ensure that there was some distance between the demands of politics and the demands of the grassroots, to allow the bureaucrat to pursue the goals of social change and social transformation. Would you still, in this context, hold that argument to be true? Are we throwing the baby out of the bathwater if we say the way to make the bureaucracy more accountable is by ensuring that ability to fire comes in, so changing the terms of the contract? Or do you, when we talk about politicization to protect the bureaucrat, that 311 still remains crucial?
As our paper points out, the protection in the Constitution and which is incorporated in the AIS, in the All India Services Acts, are essentially procedural. They talk about giving an opportunity of being heard and being told, they are fundamentally natural justice principles. I don't think that is the reason for the inability to fire. The reason for the inability to fire, I think, are more complex. Very often, a lot of corruption in government is consensual. So it's not as if one civil servant alone or one politician alone becomes corrupt. It is normally a collective act. It's not one single individual who chooses to be corrupt. So very often there will be unwillingness to act because the person who has to act may directly, indirectly also be involved in the same act. So that's problem one. Problem two, the same state capacity that we spoke about early on would need to come in here. And remember, if petroleum and finance are glamorous posts, anti-corruption, vigilance are typically not very glamorous posts. They are not glamorous posts anywhere in the world. They are very nature. They are unpleasant, drudgery. There is an enormous amount of work to be done. And our success record needs to be measured against attempts to fire. The number of attempts to fire itself is minimal for a variety of these reasons. But going beyond, I don't think we only need the ability to fire to get better performance. Better performance will come about as a result of many factors, including the ability to fire. So rather than go immediately for the nuclear option, and I am not saying you should not have the ability to fire for non-performance, and we've seen this government, without going to the nuclear option, we had those performance review based reduction or asking people to leave essentially based on assessment of performance after X number of years. That is not being done routinely. This government did a fair amount in the initial years. I have not subsequently seen the data, but the problem with that, if you again go back to the people who administer this, we don't write CRs, the confidential reports, honestly anymore. Everybody is outstanding. And you don't communicate honestly what you thought of somebody's performance. And if you're going to take decisions on retaining, firing based on that record, then you have a serious problem. So this firing business, I think, stands on an edifice that itself is weak. The ability of the people who will initiate this, the ability of the people who will actually prosecute this, the material on which this is based, and the fact that we've seen a few cases of abuse. You're not firing the guy who I know to be the most corrupt in my system. You are firing that odd guy who perhaps is corrupt, but who is not being fired for reasons of corruption, very often being fired for reasons of quote unquote independence, standing up. So I think what has muddied the waters is all these facts. But to answer your question pointedly, if the end goal is getting better performance out of the civil service, I would think there are many options before we go sharpening the firing tool.
One more democracy-related question, which in some ways is topmost on all of our minds over these last few weeks. We are recording for the audience towards the end of January, which is about the dynamic of center-state relations and the IAS in that context. You mentioned consistently in our through this conversation that core to the original design was an inbuilt element of federalism, the recognition that the center needs to have adequate representation from states. That is why the cadres are across states. There's no central cadres, and the center borrows from states for adequate representation. You also spoke about the fact that that adequate representation goal has never effectively been met, partly because certain states get overrepresented. That has a lot to do with the dynamics of the IAS, and also, as you mentioned, has something to do with politics. But over these last few years, and particularly right now in the context of the discussion on changes to the IAS rules and the fact that there are vacancies at the center, and that as democracy has deepened, the relationships between the political relationships between center and state are now deeper sites of contestation. This has become an area of great friction, and it does sometimes seem that the officer is also a pawn in this game. How does one think about preserving the core federal element of what was so core to the original design? Is that still relevant in contemporary India? And if it is, what is the best way out of this current friction between center and state, assuming that the federal contestation is now a feature of our politics?
I want to just briefly go back to the point I'd made, which is that a lot of these inherently are quote unquote incomplete contracts. The legislations can't be 100% anticipate all kinds of permutations and combinations and provide for all of them. Now, having said that, remember the AIS is a very complex structure. And why does it have to be complex? It is complex because it needs to take note of career aspirations, because for me, it is also a career. There is a public interest element, there is a job, there is the All India Services dimension, but it's also my life. So there is a career aspiration of the individual. In addition, there are a whole bunch of personal circumstances which keep varying. For instance, to be genuinely sympathetic, a person posted, let's say, in some place like Andamans or Lakshadweep, and has a child who has to enter college. There is a personal circumstance element which cannot be ignored. It cannot be dominant, but it cannot be ignored. 3, there are genuine requirements of state governments, plus the government of India's own need. In addition to all this, the design features that we spoke about, the need to keep Government of India truly all India in character, well distributed across ministries, within ministries, and to get that state viewpoint, not a state viewpoint, but the state viewpoint in Delhi. All of these are built into one instrument called the All India Services. Now, to work this, you can't write a legislation which will answer all these problems. There has to be discretion. There has to be exercise of judgment. The rules will say ordinarily at the end of X number of years in Government of India, you need to go back and quote unquote cool off in the state. But let's say you are negotiating a serious replenishment of special drawing rights in the Indian Monetary Fund. It's a once in 30-year event, and it's not an expertise that is built overnight. And let's say an individual who's negotiating it needs to stay for another 6 months. Should the Government of India not have the discretion to extend him or her by 6 months? I think by definition, Government of India should, because these are all instruments we've created. Let's go back to the public good argument. This is an instrument created for furthering the public interest. But what makes this messy is there will be that one IMF special drawing rights negotiations. On top of that will ride 25 fellows who will come and say, my child is in class 10, my child cannot study in Tamil Nadu. If Lakshadweep is a problem, Tamil medium is a problem. Now, there has to be an exercise of judgment, let's say, by the cabinet secretary to conclude, sorry, this is a genuine case, we will permit it. We believe this is not a genuine case, we will not permit this. This kind of exercise of discretion, I think, is necessary, is inbuilt into the system. So the upshot of all this is, we can write any number of rules, but you require wise people on all sides administering this. And on this, I must confess that states have been playing truant, and Government of India is the original problem creator, quote unquote, when in the early 90s, we hugely cut down on the size of the civil service. So a lot of the problems of Government of India not being able to find officers is the 1990s reductions will now begin to bite. And I want to draw your attention to something that is currently happening. I'm sure you've read about the railway civil service restructuring. I, to my horror, discovered yesterday, through the last 2 years, we've had no recruitment in the Indian Railways, in the Indian Railway Service of Engineers, in the Indian Railway officers who come through the civil service. Now, it will not be, it will not bite us today. It will take us 20 years. In 2042-43, you will have a civil service podcast which is lamenting on how did we do this? So these things take 20, 22 years, 25 years to come and haunt you. So we took those decisions. What were they based on? They were based on a certain assumption of a rolling back of the state. But it turns out states have actually gone and hugely increased the number of positions where IAS officers are being posted. And I gave the example in one of the earlier podcasts, registrars of universities, newly created medical colleges. States did not have civil aviation responsibility, but they've begun to create airports. Now, if you start sending IAS officers to all these kinds of positions, and you may have a strong argument for that, then remember, you are taking away IAS officers from some other positions, and it turns out that you're taking them away from Joint Secretary Education or Joint Secretary Social Justice in Government of India. So there is a deeper problem than just legislatively mandating that I'll have the last say. There is a genuine problem that the Government of India faces. States, by and large, if I were to take sides, states have not been very disciplined in the management of the All India service cadres. There are states which just do not send officers to Delhi. Now, should we get officers at gunpoint? It goes against the whole ethos of people coming to serve Government of India voluntarily. So I think one needs to go into this question on why are states not sending people? Why are officers not opting to come to Government of India? If work conditions and lack of professional work is the reason, can we do something to address those? And those are by definition medium-term, long-term solutions. In the short term, should the Government of India have the right to post anybody? Fundamentally, I think if you post somebody against his or her wish or against the wish of the state government, I think it's going to be counterproductive. It will create more problems. I think a lot of heads would need to, get themselves together and work out a solution which is actually harmonious. And I don't think it's difficult. States have to cut down on positions where they are, I think, needlessly wasting civil servants. Likewise, Government of India will need to be a little more choosy, because if the number of officers available overall is less, we need to prioritize. That's broadly what I would suggest.
But not an expansion of the state, because in some ways the Indian, if you compare our public employment as a per capita compared to many other democracies, actually the Indian state is remarkably small.
I think unlike the West, our problem, if you were to put it in the markets versus state kind of paradigm, I think our difficulty is we need a lot of more markets, but we also need smarter, a lot more effective, and a lot more state. Because the state should not be doing industrial licensing, but the state needs to be doing public health. The state needs to be providing public goods. And in a lot of public health, public goods areas, the Indian state collectively, local, regional, state, and Union of India is hugely wanting. So I think we, in a sense, have a good problem. We need more of both. And I think we need to go about it in a smart fashion.
Which is a fundamental change in terms of how we think about the civil services. In fact, so much of what you said is a fundamental shift. I have one last question before we summarize this conversation, which is that, again, in the context of center state, we are also increasingly seeing, and technology is enabling this, a lot more direct interaction between the state government and the district, particularly the district, and the secretaries of and government of India. In the old days, there used to be that line of DM to PM without the CM or some such. There used to be a big question about who and how should the central government engage with the state and the district. And as video conferencing has become the norm, as targets have become more clear in terms of particularly developmental functions, and as the center has appropriated many of those functions as part of its own, the need for that direct contact and direct relationship has become much more visible, and the possibilities of it have also enabled for this communication. Do you think this challenges that all India character and the fundamental federal structure of the civil services?
The answer is sort of yes and no. Because again, the underlying problem is the proliferation of central government schemes. Mm-hmm. Now, if you speak to the domain people, they will come back to you and explain their frustrations. There are a whole bunch of states which are, quote unquote, not performing well in a whole host of very basic areas, education, women and child development, nutrition, areas where it is not sort of incorrect for a national minimal aspiration. We don't want hunger. We don't want malnutrition. We want basic minimum vaccination. Now, there are a whole bunch of states which don't seem to perform. Now, if you are a Union of India civil servant sitting in health and child nutrition or a Niti Aayog, not because you want to expand your role, but just sheer frustration at inadequate performance of a whole bunch of states forces you to come up with newer and new forms of schemes where, quote unquote, you try and incentivize the state to perform. The moment you start giving money, it is not unrealistic that you will want a review. You will expect some line of sort of communication where the implementer, which often happens to be the district level functionary, to want to, or you wanting to talk to that person. So I think this tendency is not a sort of civil servant or the union political hierarchy wanting to directly get in touch with the state. I don't see it only as political. I see, and this is not a tendency which is entirely new. We've seen very many versions of this. I think the pandemic, given the Zoom and the Teams and these video call media, has brought it sort of center stage. But these kinds of things used to happen. And this is not the first time. So I think we need a debate on this larger question, namely, the Union of India has a bulk of serious money. States have a bulk of the serious responsibilities. And there are many states which have historically been lagging. How do we solve this problem? Central sector schemes have all these negatives, but they also have some positives, because some central sector schemes have actually led to much better parameters on these domains than would be the case otherwise. So I am really not able to figure out what is the way forward on achieving those minimal national aspirational goals. My emphasis would be on minimal national aspirational. Once we get over that, I think thereafter my preference would be, if a certain state is not, sort of willing to increase its capability, spend better, then sooner or later, some kind of sanction should kick in. You will not get the money will go to a better performing state, but then you have the problem of regional imbalance that leads to across the board, sort of migration. Will it lead to social imbalances? Will it then lead to, agitations? So I think these are difficult political questions, and the civil service dimension is just one small part of this larger problem. I honestly don't have an answer to the larger problem.
Which in some ways brings us back to where we started this conversation, and is a good place to wrap this really wide-ranging and interesting discussion on the civil services, the challenges it confronts, and what the possible way forward is. It is that any discourse on civil service reforms need to start with understanding the role and relationship between state and society, what we expect the state to do, from which design elements need to be debated. I think, Dr. Krishnan, you've challenged many assumptions that are made in the public discourse on civil service reforms that assume that it is a lack of capability. Therefore, you need to bring in the specialists from the outside, that it assumes that there's too many not doing the right job, whereas in fact, as you rightly say, perhaps there's too few in many places where they need to be, and it's about more state than less state in some parts, and perhaps getting the state completely out of the way in other parts. The center state dimension of this is also in fact part of this whole challenge, and most importantly, we shouldn't wish away democracy from how civil service functions. It's an inherent part of democracy, and reform should be a discussion not so much about curbing discretion through legislation, but about building in a mature relationship between the role of politics and democracy and its relationship with its technocrats.
Thank you, Dr. Krishnan. And with this, we come to the end of our 4-part series, a conversation with Dr. KP Krishnan on India's civil services. For those who followed these conversations, and for all of you out there interested in better understanding India's civil services, I couldn't recommend more for you to read the 2 chapters that frame the contours of our conversation over these last 4 series, Civil Services 1 and Civil Services 2. You can find these chapters in the 2 volumes of books on India's public institutions, edited by Devesh Kapoor and Pratap Mehta. The first volume is titled Public Institutions of India, and the second volume, which includes a third editor, Milind Vaishnav, is titled Rethinking Public Institutions in India. In addition, the Center for Policy Research has produced a large amount of research and a resource base on India's civil services, both at the front lines and its elite services. I will make a last plug for all of you to come to our website and look at our work on India's civil services. In particular, a few weeks ago, we launched a series of policy notes on administrative reforms, which I'm sure those of you who stayed with us through this series will find extremely interesting, and certainly a provocation for more thinking on this very crucial topic. India's future is dependent on our steel frame, enabling and empowering us to move forward. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. You can follow us on Twitter at CPR_India and on our website www.cprindia.org.